The $3 termite killer they hoped you would forget. The untold history of boric acid. On August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina tore through the Gulf Coast with 175-mile-per-hour winds and a storm surge that swallowed 80% of New Orleans. It killed nearly 2,000 people and caused $125 billion in damage. But in the years that followed, investigators uncovered something nobody expected. Researchers from Louisiana State University inspected the floodwalls that had failed so catastrophically and found that 70% of the seams along the London Avenue Canal showed evidence of insect attack. The culprit was the Formosan subterranean termite, a species originally from China, which had been quietly tunneling through the levee system for years. These insects had created networks of passages inside the flood barriers, a process engineers call piping, that allowed storm water to rush through and undermine structures that were supposed to protect an entire city. This was not some minor nuisance. This was a species capable of fielding colonies of 1 to 4 million individuals, roughly 10 times the size of native termite colonies, consuming wooden structures, utility poles, underground cables, and even the treated railroad ties that held the city together. In New Orleans alone, Formosan termites cause an estimated $300 million in damage every single year. And here is what makes this story relevant to every single person watching. Every year across the United States, termites cause over $5 billion in combined damage and treatment costs. Roughly 600,000 homes are attacked annually. The average homeowner who discovers an infestation spends around $3,000 to fix it. And here is the part that really stings. Standard homeowners insurance almost never covers it. But what if the most effective preventive weapon against this silent invader has been sitting on your hardware store shelf this entire time? A naturally occurring mineral compound that costs a few dollars, bonds permanently into wood, and kills any termite that takes a single bite. A substance that was well known to your grandparents' generation, used routinely in construction for decades, and then gradually forgotten, not because it stopped working, but because nobody could make serious money selling it. Welcome to Historia Prime. Today we are tracing the remarkable, hidden history of boric acid. From the goldsmith workshops of ancient Babylon to a Parisian laboratory in the year 1702, to the military barracks of early 20th century California, to the boardrooms where economic incentives quietly pushed it off the shelf. We will separate the viral myths from the verified science, give you the honest limitations that most YouTube videos ignore, and show you exactly how to apply this knowledge to protect your own home. If you believe that real independence comes from understanding the world around you, stay with me until the very end. Let us begin. Chapter 1. From Babylon to Paris, the birth of a forgotten compound. To understand why boric acid is so remarkably effective, we need to trace its origin story. And that story begins roughly 4,000 years ago. In ancient Mesopotamia, craftsmen imported a mineral called tincal, a naturally occurring form of borax, mined from the dried beds of salt lakes and transported along trade routes to Babylon. Goldsmiths prized it as a flux, a substance that lowers the melting point of metals and helps them bond cleanly during soldering. For thousands of years, this mineral remained a tool of the metalworker, a specialty chemical known to the few. Then, in the year 1702, something changed. In Paris, a German-born natural philosopher named Wilhelm Homburg was conducting experiments in his laboratory. Homburg had led an extraordinary life. Born in Jakarta, while his father served with the Dutch East India Company, he studied law in Germany, switched to natural science after meeting the great inventor Otto von Guericke, and eventually settled in Paris as a member of the Royal Academy of Sciences. He was, in every sense, a man who followed his curiosity wherever it led. That year, Homburg treated natural borax with mineral acid and allowed the water to evaporate. What remained was a fine, white, crystalline powder. He named it sal sedativum, his sedative salt, because he believed it had medicinal properties. For the next 2 centuries, this compound, which we now call boric acid, was used widely as a mild antiseptic, an eye-wash ingredient, and a food preservative. At natural trace levels, boron is actually essential for plant growth and plays a role in animal metabolism. What Homburg had absolutely no way of knowing was that he had just isolated one of the most devastatingly effective insecticidal compounds the world would ever see. Think about that for a moment. A discovery made over 300 years ago, sitting in plain sight, waiting for us to rediscover it. History is full of moments like this, where the answers we need have already been found. The question is whether we are paying attention. Chapter 2. The Military Barracks and the Invisible Shield. The story of boric acid as a pest control weapon truly begins in the early 1900s. Entomologists in California were dealing with a persistent problem: military barracks completely overrun by cockroaches. They dusted the roach pathways with boric acid powder and watched what happened. The results were devastating for the insects. Here is how it works. Under a microscope, boric acid crystals appear as tiny jagged shards. When an insect walks through even a barely visible film of this dust, the microscopic crystals cling to its legs and the waxy coating on its exoskeleton. When the insect grooms itself, as all cockroaches and termites instinctively do, it swallows the powder. Once inside the gut, boric acid disrupts the lining of the foregut, interferes with the insect's nervous system, and causes severe dehydration from the inside out. According to research compiled by the National Pesticide Information Center, boric acid inhibits digestive enzymes and essentially causes termites to starve to death. But the real genius of this compound lies in the social biology of its targets. Termites and cockroaches share an ancient evolutionary trait. They are cannibals. When a poisoned insect returns to the colony and dies, its nestmates consume the carcass. The boric acid passes from body to body, spreading through the colony like a chain reaction. By 1934, the research became definitive. In laboratory experiments documented by Randall and colleagues, termites exposed to filter paper treated with just a 5% boric acid solution all died within 4 days. Separate work by Kofoid and Williams at the University of California showed that boric acid dust injected into termite galleries killed 80% of contacted termites within 1 to 3 weeks. This was published, peer-reviewed science. Across the Pacific, Japanese builders had made a practical discovery of their own. They found that borate-treated wood was highly resistant to the Formosan termite, the same aggressive species that would later devastate New Orleans. This became standard practice in Japanese construction, a preventive barrier built into the structure itself. By the 1950s, this knowledge had spread to American builders. During the framing stage of a house, carpenters and builders would routinely dust the inside of wall cavities with boric acid powder. They called it the invisible shield. One application protected the wood for the entire life of the structure. As long as the wood stayed dry, the boric acid remained locked inside the fibers permanently. It did not evaporate, it did not degrade. If a termite ever bit into that wood, it was a death sentence. There were no callbacks, no quarterly technician visits, no annual renewal fees, just permanent, silent protection. And that, as it turns out, was exactly the problem. Chapter 3. Follow the money. Why a $3 solution became a $3,000 problem. Now we arrive at the part of the story that most people get wrong. Viral videos love to claim that the pest control industry ran a secret conspiracy to ban boric acid, that some shadowy group of corporate executives met in a boardroom and decided to erase it from history. That is a dramatic story. It is also not what happened. The truth is simpler and in many ways more interesting. Boric acid is a naturally occurring mineral. You cannot patent a mineral, and if you cannot patent it, you cannot build a monopoly around it. If you cannot build a monopoly, you cannot justify a massive marketing budget. And without a marketing budget, a product simply disappears from public consciousness. Not because anyone banned it, but because no one has a financial incentive to promote it. Consider the economics. The United States pest control industry generates between $26 and $28 billion in annual revenue, depending on which estimate you use. There are over 32,000 companies operating nationally. The top 4 corporations control roughly 27% of the market. The business model that drives this industry is built on recurring revenue. You pay $1,000 to $3,000 upfront for treatment, and then you sign an annual inspection and renewal contract costing $300 to $800 per year. This is the kind of predictable, subscription-based cash flow that Wall Street loves. Now ask yourself, where does a $3 box of mineral powder fit into that business model? The answer is, it does not. Not because anyone is running a conspiracy, but because the economic incentives simply do not align. No corporation will spend millions advertising a product that anyone can buy for a few dollars and that requires no follow-up service. This is a pattern we see throughout modern life. It is not unique to pest control. When a solution is cheap, unpatentable, and eliminates the need for professional services, it tends to fade from public awareness. Not because it is forbidden, but because nobody profits from reminding you it exists. And over time, as professional licensing frameworks were built around modern synthetic chemicals like fipronil and imidacloprid, the knowledge gap widened. New generations of homeowners were never taught what their grandparents knew instinctively, that you could protect a house with basic chemistry and a $5 trip to the hardware store. Chapter 4. The Truth About the Ban. What the clickbait gets wrong. If you search the internet right now, you will find viral claims that boric acid is banned in 23 states. This makes for a great thumbnail. It is also misleading, and the real story teaches us something far more valuable. Boric acid is not banned for pest control in the United States. According to the National Pesticide Information Center, there are over 500 EPA-registered products containing boric acid currently on the market. You can walk into a hardware store today and buy it off the shelf. What is true is this. In most states, the act of applying termiticides to a building foundation requires a licensed pest management professional. This is a general regulation that applies to all termiticides, not just boric acid. It exists because termiticide application near foundations involves real risks: groundwater contamination, improper dosing, and structural liability. Boric acid got swept up in this regulatory framework not because it was specifically targeted, but because the rules were written broadly. Now here is where the science gets genuinely important. While a single acute dose of boric acid has roughly the same toxicity as table salt in terms of lethal dose per kilogram of body weight, chronic long-term exposure is a different story entirely. Animal studies have demonstrated that sustained high doses of boron can cause severe reproductive toxicity, including testicular atrophy and developmental abnormalities in offspring. This is why the European Chemicals Agency classified boric acid as a Category 1B reproductive toxicant under the REACH regulation, meaning it is presumed to be harmful to human reproductive function based on animal evidence. The European Union has also banned it as a food additive and heavily restricted its use in cosmetics. And there is a darker chapter in this history that demands our attention. In the mid-20th century, boric acid was commonly used in baby powders and diaper rash ointments. Doctors assumed that because it was a mild antiseptic with low acute toxicity, it was safe for topical use on infants. They were wrong. Adult skin provides a reasonable barrier against absorption, but infant skin, especially when damaged by diaper rash, absorbs boric acid rapidly. The results were tragic. Infants developed a horrifying condition that medical literature calls boiled lobster syndrome, where the skin turns bright red and begins to peel away in sheets, accompanied by seizures, kidney failure, and in many cases, death. Multiple case reports documented in medical journals from the 1940s through the 1960s recorded infant fatalities from boric acid exposure through the skin. The medical community eventually discontinued its use in infant products, but not before lasting damage was done. This is perhaps the most important lesson in this entire video. Natural does not mean harmless. Water is natural, and you can drown in it. Sunlight is natural, and it causes cancer. Boric acid is an earth mineral with genuine power, and that power demands genuine respect. Anyone who tells you it is completely safe without qualification is either uninformed or dishonest. Chapter 5. Why the professionals switched. An honest assessment. In the interest of being completely fair, we need to acknowledge something that most viral boric acid videos conveniently skip. There are legitimate scientific reasons why professional pest control companies rely on modern synthetic chemicals when dealing with active, large-scale termite infestations. If we want to be credible, we need to steelman the other side. First, there is the water problem. Boric acid is highly water-soluble. This is wonderful when you want to dissolve it into a spray for treating indoor wood. It is a fatal flaw for outdoor soil treatment. If you treat the ground around your foundation with boric acid, the next heavy rain will simply wash it away, leaching it deep into the soil. Worse, high concentrations of boron in soil act as a potent herbicide. You could kill your trees, your garden, and potentially contaminate groundwater. Modern synthetic termiticides, like fipronil, bind tightly to soil particles and can remain effective for a decade or more through repeated rainfall. Second, there is the application problem. When enthusiastic homeowners discover how cheap boric acid is, they tend to make a critical mistake. They dump thick piles of white powder along baseboards and in wall voids. But insects are highly sensitive to their environment. If a termite or cockroach encounters a mountain of foreign white powder blocking its path, it simply turns around and finds another route. Research has confirmed that boric acid is non-repellent at very low concentrations, but becomes an effective barrier only when applied as a micro-thin, barely visible film. It must be an invisible minefield that the insect walks through without ever knowing it is there. Third, there is the speed problem. Boric acid requires the insect to physically ingest it. It works through the gut and then spreads through cannibalism. This takes days to weeks. Modern non-repellent termiticides, like fipronil, work through a transfer effect. A termite walks through treated soil, picks up the chemical without detecting it, and passes it to thousands of colony members just by touching them. This guarantees faster, more complete colony elimination. For a professional whose reputation, license, and financial liability are on the line, the speed and reliability of a synthetic chemical is worth the higher cost. So where does this leave us? Here is the key insight. Boric acid excels as a preventive measure, not as a cure for an active infestation. Think of it like a vaccine versus an antibiotic. You use boric acid to protect wood before termites arrive. If you already have a massive colony eating your house from the inside out, you need professional help. Period. No YouTube video should tell you otherwise. But the brilliant part is this. Prevention is where the real money is saved. If you protect your wood before the problem starts, you may never need to make that $3,000 phone call at all. Chapter 6. The Survival Protocol. How to protect your home. So, how do we take everything we have learned, all of this history and science, and apply it practically? Here is a step-by-step approach grounded in verified research. Step 1. The liquid armor. For any exposed, untreated wood in your attic, basement, crawl space, or anywhere wood is close to soil, you can create a long-lasting protective barrier. Dissolve approximately 1 teaspoon of boric acid in 1 cup of warm water and stir until fully dissolved. Using a spray bottle, apply the solution to the wood surfaces. Pay particular attention to the gaps where plumbing or electrical conduits penetrate the wood, because these are common superhighways for termites. As the water evaporates, the boric acid remains locked inside the wood fibers. As long as that wood stays dry, the protection is essentially permanent. Step 2. The invisible dust. Purchase a cheap hand bellows duster from the hardware store. Put on an N95 respirator, safety glasses and gloves. Remember, we respect the chemistry. Puff a very light, barely visible dusting of dry boric acid powder into wall cavities, behind baseboards, and under appliances. Less is absolutely more. You want a microscopic film, not a snowstorm. If you can clearly see the powder, you have used too much. At the correct invisible concentration, insects walk through it without detecting anything wrong. At heavy visible concentrations, they simply avoid it. Step 3. The bait station. If you suspect termite activity near your foundation, you can build a monitoring and bait station. Take damp, corrugated cardboard, which termites are attracted to because of the cellulose, and apply a light coating of boric acid mixed with a small amount of honey or molasses. Place these near any mud tubes or areas of known activity. Foraging termites will consume the bait and carry poisoned particles back into the colony. This method is supported by research from organizations like the Beyond Pesticides Coalition, which identifies boric acid as an effective least toxic bait at concentrations as low as 0.15%. Important safety rules. Always check your local and state regulations before applying any termiticide. Many jurisdictions require a licensed professional for foundation treatments. Never use boric acid near food preparation surfaces. Keep it away from children and pets at all times. Do not apply it to outdoor soil, as it will contaminate the ground and kill plant life. Wear proper protective equipment whenever handling the powder. And if you discover active termite damage that appears structural, call a licensed professional immediately. Prevention is a homeowner's job. Remediation of an active colony is a professional's job. Conclusion. Let us come back to where we started. New Orleans, 2005. A city brought to its knees by wind, water, and tiny six-legged engineers that had been quietly undermining its defenses for years. Researchers later discovered that many Formosan termite colonies actually survived the flooding. They were still there, still tunneling, still consuming. The history of boric acid is not a story of heroes and villains. It is a story about how knowledge gets lost when no one profits from preserving it. A German philosopher in a Parisian lab discovered a remarkable compound over 300 years ago. American builders used it routinely for decades. And then, slowly, as the economics shifted toward patented synthetics and recurring service contracts, the old knowledge faded. Not because it was wrong, not because it was banned, but because no one had a financial reason to keep it alive. You now have that knowledge back. By learning the honest science, the real limitations, and the proper techniques for using what an 18th century alchemist called his sedative salt, you are not just saving money. You are closing a gap that economics created. You are picking up a thread that your grandparents' generation dropped. And you are taking responsibility for your own home, your own space, and your own independence. If this journey opened your eyes, share it with someone who owns a home or is about to buy one. Knowledge like this should not be sitting forgotten on the bottom shelf of a hardware store. It belongs in the hands of people who will use it wisely. I am your host at Historia Prime. Keep questioning the systems around you, respect the power of nature, and never stop learning. We will see you in the next video.